Yeah, I can email you later this afternoon and so give some more specifics as to what to think about it. Addressing that. And I'll make sure I send you 7 too.
In the 7,
yeah.
Because I sent you the 6. You sent me 5 and 6 last 2 weeks. But I told you that I have enough for 5. You sent you the 6.
Okay, so you did 6 too?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I need you to tell me which one you have, because I'm so lost if you have all of them.
Okay. Yeah, if you email those, I'm sure I have them. I just couldn't remember which off the top of my head. I couldn't remember which ones.
Yeah. I just want to know if you do have all my 6.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Just another minute or so, we'll be ready to go.
Question, what's our assigned reading this week? Do you know off the top of your head?
I think it says race and economics or politics, something like that.
Do we have a quiz?
Yes, it's up
Yes,
now.
it is up.
And it's different this week. It's just a short answer question.
Oh.
So 250, 300 word response on what we've covered on racism.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's very different.
And that's due on the 6th?
No, I think I left that one until Friday or Saturday.
Oh.
Yeah, so you have most of the week to do that one.
Is it reading quiz 8?
Right, it's number 8, yeah. Okay. Anyone online, can you confirm that it's coming through? You can hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Great, thank you. Miriam, you did online for a few days? Did everything work okay?
Yeah, it was great.
Good. Okay. So we'll go ahead and get started. I want to recap a little bit, what we covered last week. We've been focused on racism, race issues. And then we'll make a couple more points about race didn't quite get to, much to your credit, because you guys were making some really good comments, and we got into some good discussion last time. So there was a few things I wanted to mention that I didn't quite get to. I want to talk about those, and then we're going to shift in a little bit and talk about diversity in politics. What an appropriate day to talk about that, right? And actually, I don't even think, I was consciously aware of it when I wrote out the syllabus last summer, that election day would be the day we started talking about politics, but such is the case. Okay, so just a little recap. A couple of things that I emphasize as we've been talking about race is, one, we talked about identity. It's the graphic here we had up last time. Shows. We talked about one of the reasons why race issues, one among other reasons, is so incendiary, so explosive, and gets people ratcheted up in opposition to each other so quickly, is because race is one of those things by which people identify themselves. And this question, who are you? What's the answer to that? What constitutes who you are as a person? Well, a lot of times race is included in that list, and anytime we strike at someone's identity, that's their most basic area, that which makes them who they are. So it's no wonder why this is so explosive, and race concerns are such a tinderbox, such a powder keg. And of course, primarily so in our culture because of our very sordid history of slavery and Jim Crow laws. I made the point, which I think is one of the most important things to consider in that discussion about identity, is that this question of what gives you value, right? What makes you as an individual valuable, that is an extremely important question. I think few questions we ever contemplate are more important than that. And the problem to which I believe we're all vulnerable is appealing to things that are unstable to establish our identity and our value. So if your answer to that question, what makes you valuable? What makes you, I'd say those are connected. What makes you valuable and what makes you who you are? How do you identify yourself? If the answer to that question is something unstable, like, for example, race, that can be really, really dangerous because what happens this is kind of a silly example, but it happens, I guess, for some people. What if somebody prides themselves, their identity is they're a white man, right? And they've always, distinguished themselves as a white person in contrast to those Mexicans or in contrast to those blacks or whatever. And they really stake their identity on that, or black, either way. Well, what happens when somebody does an ancestry trace on that person to find out, 4 generations back they have a purely African grandfather? Okay, well, that's unstable, right? I mean, now they're in crisis because I don't know who I am anymore, right? So the concern of making sure that our value as individuals and that by which we identify ourselves with are the right things that are not only stable but are good, right? Things that are meaningful. And nationality maybe is another good example. I actually think that it's a good thing to have national pride, right? To be proud to be an American or Canadian, or to be proud to be from Russia, right? Now, every nation can look back at some eras in its history and have some trepidation and thinking about some corruption and evil things that happened in the nation in the past, sure. But just the principle of appreciating and taking pride in where you're from and identifying as an American or as a Canadian or whatever it may be, or Russian, that's a good thing. However, if that is part of the deepest level, all right, where the deepest level at which we identify ourselves, even that's unstable because geopolitical situations change, and sometimes very unexpectedly and very dramatically. What if, down to the core, like who you are at your deepest part is an American. You were born on the 4th of July. Well, perish the thought. It seems hard to conceive. But what if we were overtaken by another nation? What if our government fell to that of another nation and we could no longer be Americans in any intelligible sense? Would that destroy you as a person? That's the question. What's at the center of that? So, the point in the context of racism I was talking about is I think that, as I said, race per se, not culture, but race, is a really weak and unstable thing to identify yourself with. I don't know that, it's like the point I made last week that, it'd be kind of a silly thing, true, but rather trite and silly for somebody to say, well, Mike, tell me about yourself. Who are you? And I said, well, you know what? I'm a man with brown hair. Really? What if I go bald? And have I lost my identity, So we got to be careful. And again, I think, race per se is a red herring. Usually what we mean when we talk about race is culture, and maybe ethnicity and culture go hand in hand. But we talked a lot about identity and how this is a dynamic that plays into the discussion. Also talked about, as I said, the arbitrariness of race categories, that essentially these are inventions. I made one point there. Anybody remember what I was saying, that there's an issue which really I think, if you don't follow the red herring, the distraction, the really core issue that's most significant, the thing that really drives race divisions is what? Anybody remember that? I was saying there's something else. There's something it's common to human nature across the board. We have this inclination toward something.
Setting ourselves above other people.
Exactly right. We all have this natural inclination to establish our own superiority at the expense of others. right? And which really, if superiority is your goal, then that, by definition, that requires there to be an underclass. So there has to be somebody. You can't be superior if there's nobody that's inferior, right? Those are derivative terms. Those are dependent on each other. I think that's really important because that's really the core issue. I mean, that's the problem of which racism is really just a symptom or a manifestation. Like I said earlier, if it were the case that all human beings were racially homogenous, then we'd find somebody to divide people by the size of their ears. And there'd be those big-eared people versus the small-eared people, and you know how the big-eared people are, right? Because whatever it may be, we constantly have an inclination that it needs to be disciplined and opposed and countered and checked. But that's what's the core of the problem, and that's present in people of all races, right? So, like I said, we have to be careful about losing track here and getting thrown off course by the red herring. All right, one thing that I didn't get to on Thursday, Thursday, today's Tuesday. And this, I apologize for the hodgepodge nature here. I'm kind of bouncing back and forth to points, but again, in part because you guys make for some great discussions, and I got a little off track here and there. But I wanted to reiterate two things. One, about the instability or the arbitrariness of race categories, and something that's of historical significance here in our Utah context. And I want to make one more note. I want to show you a little video about issues with police, racism and police bias. Okay, so on the point of, I was going to bring the text up. In fact, maybe it's here. If it's here quick, I think I can get it up. Yeah, there it is. You don't have this on the assigned reading. However, that's really lamentable because everybody should read Frederick Douglass. Every person, I believe, and especially every American. His work is, some of the most significant literature in American history. As you see, one of his famous works here is the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. He was a slave born in Maryland, and he was into his adult years when he was actually rescued out of slavery and taken into freedom by some people from the north. But he was very intelligent, very articulate guy. It's fascinating if you read. Anybody read this? Read it in high school? If you remember how he learned how to read, he would trade. He worked as a house servant or slave in the city in Maryland, and he would go out into the alley where the little white kids that were much younger than him were running around, and he would trade them something so that they would teach him his letters, so that he could learn to read. Because it was in some cases against the law to teach slaves to read, because one of the most powerful lessons in this piece is that education and slavery are mutually exclusive. That if you educate a group of people, if they're slaves, they can't remain slaves because they would have too much perspective and knowledge. Anyway, he's very, very well-educated, very intelligent guy. And he goes on and recounts through this narrative his experiences, and he reflects on that. And it's really difficult to read, but it's very powerful. I want to read one point that, it's not just for Utah, but again, with this issue of the arbitrariness and the ambiguity, and again, the way that race is used to and don't take me the wrong way. Some people see the whole world through this lens of power and oppression. Right? I think that's a pretty unhealthy way to see things. It's pretty distorted. But in this case, when we talk about race categories actually are a good example of a tool that people invent that's used to keep others down, to again establish their own power and superiority. There's a great insight into that and again the arbitrariness of it in Douglass here. And I've got to get past the preface, it's pretty long, sorry. So you may know this about him, but like Barack Obama, Frederick Douglass was actually mulatto. He was half white and half black, and sadly, the tragedy here just goes in all different directions. He believed that his slave master, was his biological father. So he talks about here in the beginning, he mentions that. So, let's see, this is a big piece here, I'm trying to find the place here. Still not to the first chapter. There we go. All right. So he says, my father was a white man. He was admitted to be such by all I ever heard speak of my parentage. The opinion was also whispered that my master was my father, but of the correctness of this opinion I know nothing. The means of knowing was withheld from me. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant, before I knew her as my mother. It is a common custom in the part of Maryland from which I ran away to part children from their mothers at a very early age. So again, just such a heart-wrenching tragedy. And he goes on to recount how when he was a small child, he never really knew his mother because she was only ever able to see him at night, and she would have to work on this other plantation to which she was sold, and then walk after work through the night hours just to go and see her son when he was a child, an infant. And then eventually she died. He never really knew her. But think about this. I may have mentioned this in passing earlier. So if being black makes somebody a slave, or let's say in that mentality, in that worldview, if being black makes someone inferior to white people and therefore rightfully makes them enslaved by those who are superior, well, if you're only half black and you're half white, shouldn't that mean that you're only half a slave? Or that you occupy some level of privilege that would be above the fully black people? Because if being white makes you superior, then at least you're superior over those who are 100% black if you're only 50% black. But it didn't work that way. And do you remember the other piece that I'll just reference? We're not going to read it together, but the passage from To Kill a Mockingbird, when Jim and Scout, everybody read that, To Kill a Mockingbird, before? Good. Another one of those classic, super valuable pieces of American literature. But there's that scene at the end that's in your assigned reading where they're having this conversation in the bedroom, the little girl and her brother, and they talk about these children that are mixed race or they have black and white ancestry. And she says something to the effect of, well, Jim, how can you tell? Because they look white to me. And he says, it doesn't matter. If they just have one drop of Negro blood, that makes them Negro. Well, who determines that? Where's the manual that lays all that out? And then there's a great line toward the end of that where she says, Jim's talking, says, I think I got it figured out. There's 4 different kinds of folks. There's those that live down by the river, or those that live out by the landfill, and the Negroes, and then there's those that live in town. And then Scout, remember what she says in response? Jim says, there's these 4 different kinds of folks. And then Scout says, I was thinking, why can't there just be folks? Why can't there just be, why do we have to categorize, from the mouth of a child? Right? But the same point, just one drop of Negro blood makes you Negro. And I'm not saying like whose word, I'm trying to illustrate the point here of this is just so completely ambiguous and arbitrary. Why was Frederick Douglass still considered fully black slave if his father was a white man? These are just odd things. And if you try to really nail that down, it's perpetually elusive. Now the other thing I want to say was, let's see, we didn't talk about Brigham Young and the Curse of Cain, did we? We didn't get to that Thursday. I was planning on talking about that. So here he's talking about the same issue of having the white father, the slave master father. He says, every year brings with it multitudes of this class being the mulatto mixed race slaves. It was doubtless in consequence of a knowledge of this fact that one great statesman of the South predicted the downfall of slavery by the inevitable laws of population. Because if they're half white, they shouldn't be slaves, right? Well, that's not how it worked. But whether this prophecy is ever fulfilled or not, it is nevertheless plain that a very different looking class of people are springing up at the South and are now held in slavery from those originally brought to this country from Africa. And if their increase do no other good, it will do away with the force of argument that God cursed Ham, and therefore American slavery is right. If the lineal descendants of Ham are alone to be scripturally enslaved, it is certain that slavery at the South must soon become unscriptural. So if you're not familiar with that, there are 2 stories in the book of Genesis which were appealed to by a number of white people in the 19th century to legitimize slavery. And one of them was the story of Ham. So the story of Noah and the flood, after the flood is over with. I guess this is maybe somewhat of an obvious point, but I think my understanding is that in Middle Eastern culture, this is even much more than we might perceive it to be. But the act of seeing someone, especially a male, like a patriarch of the family, seeing, say, someone's father naked, that was just egregiously disrespectful. Right? That was a horrible thing for somebody to do. Well, there's a story after the flood that Noah has too much to drink, and he goes into his tent, apparently unclothed, and he passes out, and he has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the two of the sons, Shem and Japheth, they put up a covering and they walk backwards to cover their father so they don't see him. but Ham is not so respectful, and he sees his father, and there's some remark that there's a curse. He'll be cursed because of this disrespect. There's that story, and then there's also the story of Cain and Abel in early Genesis, where Cain and Abel are the sons of Adam and Eve, and Cain, they both offer sacrifices. One offers the meat, Abel offers the meat sacrifice, which is more valuable, and Cain offers the vegetable sacrifice, which doesn't cost as much, I guess. And then Abel has favor with God, and there's jealousy, and Cain kills his brother, and then it is said that after the murder, God places a curse on him. Now, in the book of Genesis, it never specifies what the curse is, but this was latched onto by some, say, Southern slave owners. This is what Frederick Douglass is talking about when he says, this race of mixed race slave children, at least if nothing else, it will do away with the curse of Ham. Because the idea was that the curse of Ham and the curse of Cain was black skin. And that's, when you see black people today, so the argument went, you're seeing the posterity of Cain and or Ham, and that's why they're black, because they were cursed. That was the consequence of the curse. And I mentioned this just because it's relevant in our context. That's exactly what Brigham Young taught. In fact, that's why blacks couldn't hold the priesthood in the LDS Church until the 76, 78, something like that. Because he said that they were descendants of Cain, and that they were cursed with, and his words were, black skin and flat noses. That was how God, that was the mark that God had put on them because of the curse. So obviously Brigham Young was not the only one to say that, but this was a relatively popular sentiment among people, say, in the South, who claimed allegiance to the Bible as a scriptural scriptural authority, and claimed to subject themselves to its dictates. So they had to find some way to legitimize what they were doing, and that's one of the ways that they did that, and that's how and that's what Douglas is appealing to. One of the most disturbing, to me at least, sections of the narrative of American Slave is when he talks about, I think it was his Master Alt. There's two that I get mixed up in there. I think it was him, but anyway, he said Master Alt had a Christian conversion. He went to these revival meetings with the local Christian preacher, and he converted and claimed to become a follower of Christ. And when we heard this news, we were so hopeful that he would become a more benevolent and merciful master. But in fact, he was worse. He was worse after that. I thought, man, that is so pitiful. But anyway, Douglas has quite a lot to say about religion and the way that people in the South would appeal to their religious beliefs and scriptural teachings to as leverage to keep blacks in slavery. The point there is just to underscore and illustrate what I said earlier, that this is a tool, like Chesterton says in that piece that you had, I paraphrase it, but there's been no invention that has come more to the service of the rich and the stupid than the invention of the races, something to that effect. But it's a tool. You separate people, categorize, you relegate some to the inferior category, and then you use those categories and those labels to leverage and elevate yourself and maintain your own position of power there. I mean, that's how slavery was maintained by those who were able to maintain it for the time that it was. All right, now I want to jump over, and again, I apologize for the inconsistency here, the haphazard way, but there was a video I wanted to show you. It's about 5 minutes or so about police brutality, police bias and racism. Any comments or any thoughts before we go forward? All right. So this guy is John McWhorter. He is a language professor at Columbia University in New York City. And a couple of things I want to emphasize before I show you this. I'm showing this because I think this is great perspective, and it's also, he really models, he's a great example of honest, critical thinking, okay? And he's to be commended for that. He talks in here, you'll hear him in a minute, say how he changed his views in light of the facts. Remember when we talked about those sins against philosophy and those ways of distorted thinking, to be an ideologue. An ideologue is somebody who's always more committed to their preconceived beliefs than they are to the truth. And for an ideologue, if their beliefs are inconsistent with the facts, then so much the worse for the facts. Because their commitment to that, whatever it is, to the Republican Party or the Democrat Party or whatever, that comes first. And if there's something that says, actually, you're wrong on that, that's not true, the ideologue either denies it or tries to distort it and make it something it's not, or just forgets about it altogether, right? Just doesn't take into account. So I think he's a good example of somebody who chooses not to do that, who really follows the facts wherever they may lead. And I also want to emphasize that I really appreciate what the guy says here, but there are some points where, like for example, I've heard him talk elsewhere on religious belief in general, and I would adamantly disagree with him on a lot of his views about religious beliefs. So I think he's profoundly wrong on some things, but that doesn't change the fact that he's very right on this. All right. So I'm just trying to, back to our discussions on critical thinking, I'm just trying to point out the importance of trying to set those labels and biases and tensions aside and just look at what's really there. Okay. So like I said, we'll just do about 5 minutes.
When we discuss racism in America and
one more thing,
whether it exists.
Those of you online, I apologize. I tried once before I showed a video in class. Those who are online said it did not come through. So I will send this link to you. Maybe you'll be able to hear it, but if this is distorted, just wait about 5 minutes and we'll be done with it. And then I'll send you the link so you can watch it online.
So what's that now? The first thing on a lot of our minds is racism from the police. And so I think we need to talk about that first. And there's some things that I don't think we always know. Tamir Rice was a black boy of about 12 who was brandishing a toy weapon, and he was shot dead. The exact same thing happened to a boy named Daniel Shaver not long after that. Daniel Shaver was white. Sam DuBose was shot dead by the police driving his car away from a cop. The exact same thing happened, actually a little bit before that, to a white guy named Andrew Thomas. Alton Sterling was a black man who reached into his waistband and reached for his wallet during an altercation with the cops, and the cops shot him dead. That was a grievous event. And the same thing actually happened around the same time to a white guy named Dylan Noble. Alton Sterling made national headlines. None of us heard about Dylan Noble. George Zimmerman said some really nasty things about unspecified little people and how they're always going around stealing things before he ended up killing Trayvon Martin. Now, that was a terrible thing, especially because a policeman said the same sorts of things, including using the word fucker, before he killed a white teenager named Lauren Simpson. I could do this for 20 minutes. There is a very understandable tendency in the media to report stories of black people unjustly killed by the police. Whereas what we don't know is that for every one of those events, there is a white teenager or 20-something who is killed under almost ominously similar conditions where you've really got to dig to find it out. Now, I'm not saying that there's fake news or some grand conspiracy. I understand why the media are so concerned with the black cases. But I'm bringing this up because I think that generally we are often told that any conversation about race is shut down by the purported racist tendencies of cops who, in a hair-trigger situation, will allow their quiet bias to kill a black guy when, if it were a white guy, he would get away with a slap on the hand. That's a very reasonable assumption. But you know, that really hasn't held up to scrutiny, and it's why I allowed myself to do this particular debate with this particular question. Even the numbers are quite different from what we hear. And so, for example, there is the issue of proportion. So, white man.
Okay, stop it there. He goes on to say, which is, again, one of the points I really appreciated. He goes on to say that he says, I can't believe I'm saying this. Because for quite a while, he maintained the idea that, generally speaking, racism as a problem in America is not as bad, not nearly as bad as people make it out to be, except for the police. He says that when it came to the police, he held the idea that there's still a bias issue, and police, generally speaking, are, more, or let's say less reluctant to apply fatal force to a black suspect than they would a white. But he had a friend that he was communicating with, Glenn Lowry. I think he's a pretty well-known blogger. I'm not familiar with him, but he says, this guy Glenn Lowry said, hey, this doesn't stand up to the facts. And they were arguing, and McWhorter says, look, if you're going to make that, if you're going to try to convince me, you need to give me some numbers and statistics. And he says he actually didn't think that those statistics existed, but they did. And he says once I started actually looking at the numbers, that he changed his view. Again, that's the opposite of an ideologue. I also mentioned before, I think I couldn't recall his name, but his name is Roland Fryer. He's of African descent, black man who's a professor at Harvard, and he did a study on this very thing, on what the statistical data says on the propensity of white officers to apply force against black or white suspects. And he said it was one of the most surprising, I read a quote from him, he says one of the most surprising research outcomes that he'd ever had, because he actually found out that in many cases, white cops are more reluctant to deploy fatal force against black suspects. They actually hesitate more on that, according to his research. Anyway, I just want to show you that because just such a good example of, like I said, critical thinking. And I really appreciate the point, too, where he says there's very understandable tendency in the media to portray or to look for a white-black bias in police shootings. And that's a great distinction. That's a great point to point out, because it is understandable, given our sordid history of slavery and Jim Crow laws. I mean, obviously, is one of the most obvious things we could say is that people are sensitive about race issues because of the history, but you can't, this goes back to my point about sentimentalism, you can't allow that sympathy to just skirt over or fly over the facts. Right? It's a balance. You should maintain the sympathy. We should always see the weight of the evil, the immorality of slavery and Jim Crow laws, but you don't let your sympathy, you don't put that in the driver's seat, and you don't let that to completely color over everything that's presented about the issue, right? That's sentimentality. Is that?
Yeah, I think that there's just such an overwhelming because of how really how recent all of those things were. Back in the 50s or 60s. I remember growing up, I saw videos of police officers beating black people, when they did the bus protests and things like that. And that's in living memory,
Mm-hmm.
And so you have people that are still really sensitive to that. And I'm sure there are multiple individuals within the police force that do hold on to those tendencies. But it's hard to prove that every single, you can't prove that every cop has this unintentional bias,
Right.
or that it's built into the system. Obviously there are those lingering effects that need to be addressed, but I think you can't really say ultimately that it's definitely part of that.
Right, and you hit on another point I wanted to just say in recapping our discussion. That's one of the, I think, most important points to keep in mind as we study, discuss, think about racism, that distinction between the personal and the institutional. And you said it's hard to tell to what extent this bleeds into the system. That's the question. I mean, sadly, yes, there are racist individuals and racist police officers. Tragically so, and when that's known, I'll give you an example. I think I've seen problem me saying this, given that I'm not saying names. I mentioned to you before that I work full-time for the Department of Corrections, and that also entails the adult parole and probation entity, and those are full-fledged police officers, state police officers. Well, recently, there was a state police officer who was fired because of some angry, racist post he had made on social media. So, point being, that's just a real-life example. If there's a racist individual, and that's clear and that's evident, certainly that needs to be dealt with, but that makes a really important illustration. Okay, you have individual racist cops. That comes to be known. They post something on social media that's really disrespectful and racist. okay, the administration of that police force calls the person on it, they get disciplined, and then if it's seen to be to a certain extent, they're dismissed and no longer can work as a police officer. Okay, that's the way to deal with it. But do you see, am I missing something in saying this? That let's say if some civilian or group of civilians sees this racist post from a police officer or sees the video of Chauvin and George Floyd, and then instead of like the law enforcement administration taking action on this to discipline the personnel, the mob goes and screams, defund the police and burns down a building and, masses on the police precinct. It's not a systemic problem. It's not an institutional problem. It's an individual problem. And that distinction between the personal and institutional is so crucial. Now, of course, if there is evidence of systemic issues, policies in a government or a school or whatever it may be, that actually clearly work against a certain group of people, then absolutely that should be dealt with. But as I said before, to make that jump, to see this personal injustice, this corrupt individual who posts on social media or even attacks an individual in real life on the street, to go from that to tear down the institution, reform the institution, that's misfire. That's not going to do anything but make things worse, right? So that difference is so front and center between the personal and the institutional, because personal problems can't be dealt with. Let me say it differently. You deal with personal problems in very, very different ways than you deal with institutional problems. And an institutional approach to a personal problem does not work. And although I would say that sometimes personal approaches can change institutions, because if you have individuals who have a change of attitude, change of heart, then the individuals that comprise the institution can change the institution that way. But definitely the institutional protest against personal issues that's a mismatch. Okay. So any other thoughts about the race issue, about the police bias, the ambiguity of race, the identity of race, and so forth? And you guys spent up all your good discussion points last week? Is that nice? Or anybody voted yet? Or are you just worn out? Are you psychologically exhausted from all the political stuff?
Yes.
Maybe.
Let it be over with.
Yes, let it be over with. Just, it's just, I don't know. Just choose some guy. Let him be president. Let's get it over with, right? It's like one of my favorite novels by G.K. Chesterton. It's supposed to be, he wrote it in the early 1900s, but it's supposed to be England in the late 20th century, and they've changed the way they select the king. So instead of through heredity, through the royal dynasty, they have a committee appointed, and they just get the phone book and randomly choose somebody to be king. And there's a line in there where one person says, that seems so odd. He says, well, you never know who you're going to get, but the same is true when you have a dynasty, right? It's not like you're any more confident in who's going to be from the king's lineage than you would from the phone book. So anyway, so let's switch and talk about the difficulty of diversity, political, cultural, and religious. What an appropriate time, right? Of all days. Get some water. So, Colton, what's the class that you're taking? Is it diversity in film?
Yes, it's diversity in film.
Okay. And just an examination of diversity issues, dynamics in portrayals in film?
Basically, so far we've gone over, first we went over race in film and different things about that. We went over class, and now we're going over gender representation.
Okay. That should be an interesting class. Man, I'm wrestling with the mask today. Yeah, that's interesting, some of the points that seems to have connected with what you're studying there in this class. So first off, not a new insight to anybody, I realize, but something that's good to always to remind ourselves of, that certainly you've all heard the phrase, the American experiment. And that's really, really apt, because that's exactly what it is. As those of us who have lived in this country most, if not all of our lives, it's easy to forget that, but we are, in the context of the history of civilizations, in contrast to other countries around the world, we are a very, very unique nation, and primarily because of the diversity in those three areas, among others. Usually, I think I've made this comment before as it applied to a previous point, but usually what it means to be of a nation is that you and others in the nation, your other nationals or your fellow countrymen, are bound together by a religion, or a race and ethnicity, or let's say a particular culture or set of customs, or a language. And we could add a few things to that list. That's, I mean, typically if you say, what nation are you, that's what you're talking about if you talk to people around the world, right? Well, okay, meet somebody from Saudi Arabia. What does it mean to be a Saudi Arabian? Well, it means to be a Muslim. And, you know, I would say probably 95, 98% time it means to be, you know, racially Middle Eastern or Arabic, right? It means that you speak Arabic, the language, okay? Okay, well, is there an American religion? Of course not, right? Is there an American race? Of course not. Is there an American language? I mean, officially, yes, but there are some places in America, if you go to, say, Miami, where you are not going to do real well if you only speak English. So it's not the case that all Americans speak English. So being an American does not mean we're of the same race or the same religion, same even cultural heritage to some extent. It doesn't mean we speak the same language. So what does it mean? What is it that binds us in common as Americans, that we are American together when other people aren't? That's a hard question. You know, I think one thing that should be pretty fundamental to that is founding principles of our liberal democracy, that, you know, the idea that all individuals are endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights, and the opportunity for all people to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, and so forth. I mean, some of these distinct, you know, principles in the founding documents, those should certainly bind us together. But to extend out from that is a challenge, because, again, it's a challenge that people in most other countries don't have to face. All right, just for clarity's sake, as a side note as we go along, so the political spectrum, just to, you know, clarify that, not that that's a new concept for you either, but, you know, the left of the political spectrum usually emphasizes the importance of government and government's responsibility to manage and you know, undergird the society. So typically the left is for big government, expansive government, and then the right is for minimal government. And in the United States, the left would be the Democratic Party, and the right, the Republican Party, of course. And the emphasis on the right Republican side is, I mean the right in contrast to left. I'm not trying to subtly make an argument there. I don't mean the correct side, but is that individual freedoms are a priority, and people should be individually free of government influence when they run their business, and certainly when they worship as their, you know, conscience dictates, and so forth and so on. They should be taxed minimally. I think all sane people recognize that there is a need for government. We all would want government to be in charge of putting roads in and the military and things like that. But when you extend out from that, say healthcare. Should the government be in charge of healthcare? Should the government raise our taxes and then just have a universalized government-run healthcare system? That's the case in some European countries, I think in Canada to a large extent. Well, that's where the controversy comes in. How much government should be involved, and how much should it be up to the private sector, the individual entrepreneur, and that kind of thing. So the extreme left would be utter totalitarian regime where the government controls every aspect of life, and the extreme right would be the anarchist, where there's no government at all, and it's all, you know, basically a mob rule, individual. Interesting thing, in whatever case you see the absence of government, when you just have individuals together with no, you know, overarching authority, it just never ever turns into utopia, does it? You just never see it turn into this flowery, harmonious, you know, community where everybody's looking out for each other's best interests. You know, you guys read Lord of the Flies? There you go. Right? That's kind of a microcosm of life as we know it. And again, points back to this issue of these internal weaknesses and corruptions in human beings. All right. So on the map here, excuse me. Tell you what, I'm going to save everybody's name from the classes this semester and however many more semesters we go. But once COVID is over with, I'm going to send you out a notice, and we're going to have a big mass burning party. Everybody's invited. Anyway, so the dots on the map represent different cultures, different outlooks, different beliefs, different views of the world, different understanding of how life is supposed to be lived, and different political philosophies and different expectations about the government. All right, so each color represents different views on that respect. So let's do a little thought experiment. I've got a couple of travel analogies to draw your attention to. So let's say you started out where I went to undergraduate, where I went to college before I became elderly. I said it at the other class, and they're like, yeah, like you're elderly. Anyway, totally backfired on me. Troy, Alabama, okay? Actually, it would be a little south of that, but let's say you start out on a trip, and you start in Troy, Alabama, and your whole, let's say you're coming from another country, and you speak English, but you just want to get a feel for life in the United States. So in each place you go, you spend several days, you talk to the locals, you go into the popular restaurants, maybe even you attend a religious service of some sort that's common in the area, and you just get a feel of the flavor of the place, okay? So let's say you travel from Troy, Alabama, and then you go to Miami, Florida, and then you go to a plane in Miami, and you go from Miami to North Dakota. Is it Pierre? It's Bismarck, North Dakota. Is that right? South Dakota. Pierre and Bismarck. Anyway, you go to North Dakota from Miami. You spend a few days in that'd be fun to go from Miami to North Dakota in January, wouldn't it? But you go to North Dakota, you spend a few days there, and then you go to Miami, North Dakota, and then you go from North Dakota to San Francisco, and you spend a few days there, and then you get to San Francisco, you get on a plane, and you go to Boston. And then from Boston, you go to, let's say, Amarillo, Texas. Now, you think somebody who, say, spent several months and did that trip I just described, and then they went back home and someone said, how was it? You think that person would say, oh, it's pretty much the same everywhere I went. No way. In fact, there's probably, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch for somebody to say, man, I felt like I was in a different country even though I was in the United States the whole time. I felt like I was in a different, like I'd crossed the borders, right? And if you travel very much, you know that's true. Even in Utah, I think we talked about that last week, that try to go to Ogden sometime and just go in one of the Walmarts in Ogden, and then get in your car and drive for an hour and go into the Walmart in Saratoga Springs. Totally different culture, totally different feel. You'll think you're on the East Coast in Ogden compared to going to Saratoga. So even in small areas like that, right? Well, the question is, when you have this much diversity in the way, the culture of San Francisco versus Southern Alabama versus Miami versus Boston versus North Dakota, when you have that much diversity, how do you devise a political system that will enable all the people with their wide array of political, religious, philosophical beliefs and various heritages? How do you devise a political system that enables all those people to live together in a harmonious community where everybody is able to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, and nobody feels like their rights are being trampled upon and that someone else is being privileged at their expense? How do you do that? That's extremely hard. All right, that's extremely hard, and not many other governments in the history of the world have had to do that, because not many other nations have had that kind of diversity. So let's say in contrast, let's say you went to Sweden, and you went to Stockholm, and then from Stockholm you went down, I don't really know my Swedish geography very well, but you went to some other city in Sweden, say on the southern tip of the country, spent a few days there, same thing, and then you went to the north of Sweden to some other city. You probably would feel like you're in the same country the whole time, right? I mean, there would be differences from city to city, just like I said here there are, but you wouldn't feel like you were just in a wildly, vastly different place, because as culturally speaking, Scandinavia is pretty homogeneous. And you'd have more differences, but there's probably significantly less cultural difference going on an international trip from Finland to Sweden to Norway to Iceland than there would be from going to Alabama to California in the same country, right? So this is a challenge.
Don't you think our size has something to do with it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, in fact, I was just going to talk about the geographical aspect of that, yeah. No question. In fact, I've heard, spent a short time in England, a couple different trips, and I've heard people comment on, they have, like, Europeans have no sense of how large America is. And they're like, say, oh, you went to Chicago? Could you just drive over to Los Angeles after that? Like, well, that's what, 18 hours or something?
Yeah. Well, it's like you hear jokes, people who are like, oh yeah, I drove from Germany to so-and-so in a couple hours.
Right.
You know, and that's just like easy, whereas like Texas, you can drive for 4 hours and still be in Texas.
Oh, you drive for like 16 hours and still be in Texas.
Yeah.
You can drive 4 hours and you'll still be in Houston. You know what I mean?
Right, yeah, absolutely. Yes, and here's another thing about geography I was going to point out. Okay, let's take Wyoming, and we could say the same thing for southern Utah. You know the Utah map ends at Provo, right? As the joke says. But, so think about issue of gun rights. A Second Amendment right, citizens, private citizens own weapons. Okay, Wyoming is the least populated state, and you know, again, if you took out the population corridor from Ogden to let's say Payson, if you took that out, Utah would be very, very similar. I was telling the other group, I love Wayne County, the Capitol Reef and that whole area down there. I go down there as much as I can. But anybody been to Hanksville? Have you really?
I feel like I've driven through it in some
Probably.
I mean, yeah, we go to Capitol Reef.
Oh, good.
Like anytime we can. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm like you on that. Well, yeah, so Hanksville is like on the opposite end of Capitol Reef on the stretch of highway there. But they're both in Wayne County, and the county seat of Wayne County is in Bicknell, and that's 50 miles from Hanksville, all right? So I was down there one time, I was in this little cafe ordering my buffalo burger, and there was this young girl behind the counter, and she looked like she was about high school age, and I was just curious. I said, I wonder what it's like to grow up there, because this is a crazy place. I mean, I think there's what, like 2,000 people in the entire county? And I said, so you go to school? I said, are you high school age? She said, yeah. And I said, where do you go to school? And she said, oh, I go to Wayne County High School. I said, that's in Bicknell. That's 50 miles from here. She said, yeah, it's 50 miles. We do our homework on the bus. It's an hour there and an hour back. You know, I thought, wow, that's a crazy life. But here's the point. Okay, if you live somewhere like that, or you live in rural Wyoming, how would your setting, how would that shape your outlook on gun control in the Second Amendment? So here's another element to think about. Another rural county that I've heard something interesting about, Millard County, which is 100 miles south of us or so. Millard County goes from I-15 to the Nevada border. Okay, it is large, and it actually goes a little bit east of I-15. But so in Utah County, how many sheriffs? There's the city police departments, and there's also the Utah County Sheriff's Department. How many sheriff's deputies do you think there are for Utah County? I don't know, maybe 100. Maybe that's right. In Millard County, for the Millard County Sheriff's Department, there are 6 deputies. In fact, I think there's 5 deputies and the sheriff. And it goes from I-15 to Nevada. Okay, so if you live somewhere like that, and you're under threat, somebody approaches you, or somebody is breaking into your home, or trespassing on your property and threatening your family, how long do you think it's going to take the cops to get there? Now, it may not necessarily take long, but it could. So, and not only that, but that setting, obviously, not for everybody, but for a lot of people, that's going to open up a lot of opportunity and make people inclined to hunt more, right? But that's going to really change the way you think about owning a gun. Okay, what if you lived in New York City? And there's, thousands and thousands of people that you encounter within, say within 10 feet of your own person, just in the course of walking 6 or 8 blocks down the street. From all over the world, literally. Now, if something happened and you had to call 911, how soon do you think it would take a cop to respond in New York City? I mean, there's probably one already standing on the street, right? And they're everywhere. Well, okay, a person in New York City, maybe the same person, if one moves from one to the other, but a person in New York City is going to have very different views and thoughts on people owning guns and being free to buy a gun whenever they want to than somebody who lives in Wyoming or in Millard County or Wayne County. So, and I think that's important to point out because it's so often pointed as, framed as this debate between enemies or this, tit for tat, this side against the other, but a lot of it's just dictated by the setting and the logistical reality of, like I said, the geography, distance, and things like that. And that's just one more added element to what makes the diversity so hard to manage there, is that?
Yeah, it's like there's no one size fits all way to govern the United States because it's just so vastly different wherever you go. Like I had, like the example you brought up, New York City. I lived in New York City when I was 12, and I lived there for 5 months. And like before that, I lived in rural Missouri, and it was such a culture shock to go there. It was a completely different world, and you can't govern them the same. Like I think that those kind of things should be determined locally, honestly, and like sometimes even a state level is too big for those kind of issues.
All right.
So
yeah, you're right.
But then like how do you keep order in like each municipality having their own different laws, which then I mean.
And that's and again, what you're saying.
Would it become like the city-states of medieval Europe, you know?
That's right. The city-states of medieval Europe. And also, I heard somebody make this point one time and it really stuck with me because I thought, man, that makes so much sense. Why is it, now there's a lot of factors, or I'm not isolating this in one factor, but why is Western Europe and the United States, Western Europe and North America, technologically and politically, why are we so much more advanced and stable than most African countries? You know, what is that? Because I mean, there's no question about that. It's not saying it's anybody's fault, but it's true. I mean, the Western world, technologically and politically, are just light years more stable and advanced than say, a lot of Central African countries. Well, one of the fundamental reasons is tribalism. That there's no unity. There's no, not no, but you know, over time, there has not been like a centralized political authority that regulates all of life. It's this tribe and that tribe and that tribe and this tribe. I got to spend 9 days in Ethiopia once, and we were going into these houses doing this service work, and the group I was with had brought a Bible to this woman, and we were in, they called it a village, but it was several thousand people, but this village where we were, it was about a 40-minute van ride from the capital. All right, from large metropolitan city, the capital of Ethiopia, get a van drive 40 minutes to this little village. The group I was with presented this woman as a gift. They gave her this Bible that was it's called Amharic, the native Ethiopian language. All right, it's a Bible in their language, and she had to go and get somebody to read part of it to her because she didn't speak. She's an Ethiopian. She didn't speak the native Ethiopian language. She had a tribal language, and she only spoke that. And I knew somebody who adopted children from Ethiopia, and she said, yeah, this idea of being an Ethiopian, a lot of the people that live in Ethiopia, they just see that as something that was imposed upon them. They're not Ethiopian, they're a tribesman. Well, when things are that way, there's only so far you can get in terms of political stability and again, advancement, because they're speaking different languages, they're working on different systems and so forth. So that's on one end of the spectrum, but on the other end is this centralized control from one side of the country, in a country that's 3,000 miles wide, making one size fits all decisions for everybody, right? So there's some kind of balance in between.
Going into it, it really is a cultural thing, especially a balance between states' rights, local rights, and the entire federal rights.
Right.
Because at the very beginning of the creation of the country, what we originally thought of it as is that the states were more readily going to give freedoms to the people, and then the federal would protect, just kind of with a loose working chain type of thing.
Right.
And when the Civil War happened, a new idea kind of formed of having the federal government also protecting the general rights of everybody and regulating the states back and forth.
Right.
And so it's just it's very interesting to see how our country has kind of tried to adapt to the different situations in order to maintain.
Yeah, and I think, like I said, that balance is so crucial, because I think, like the point Zach made is right, that decentralizing a lot of the policies and laws is a good thing, and let people in Wyoming make decisions that are appropriate for living in Wyoming and let people in New York City do likewise. But you definitely don't want 50 independent countries. You definitely don't want that, right? Because I hate to say that, and that's really cynical, but in probably a much shorter time than we would imagine, it wouldn't be 50 independent countries, it would be 50 states of China or 50 states of Russia, all right? And that's one concern, right? It would melt down quickly.
Just look at Europe. I mean, all the small little countries that, you know, like that's a result of this kind of mentality, I guess, maybe. I don't really know much about Europe.
Like Luxembourg, right? How does that even exist?
Right. You have these tiny little teeny countries that, I don't know, that there's just not a lot of order and a lot of conflict between them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Miriam?
I think that like it's discussions like this that make you appreciate the U.S. Constitution and the amendments and things like that, just because, you know, like this is so much land and there's so many thousands and millions of people that live here that like, and we're still able to work together for the most part as a cohesive whole, you know, and I think that's what makes the U.S. such an admirable and formidable force, you know, because we're
Right.
able to come together as a people to make these decisions and to work together. I was just thinking as we were talking about, you know, all these different states and things like that, there's this TV show that I remember my geography teacher in high school talking about when we used to watch it, called How the States Got Their Shapes.
Okay.
Have you seen that?
No, I've heard of it. I've seen it.
Yeah, they just like break down the history of like, you know, the little squabbles and things like that that gave all those little squiggles and all these different shapes. And I just think it's interesting to see how like, you know, from the creation of our country to now, how things have just changed and had to change just because, you know, there is no one size fits all. It has to be adapted.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, it's so important that we do learn as we grow in diversity and so forth, that we do learn how to negotiate that so that we can keep it strong, you know. Question?
Yeah, the huge difference is because here, Brazil is the same. It is so many cultures together, so many influences. In Europe, you are just that line.
Mm-hmm.
You are straight to that line for generations.
Right.
And here, and in Brazil, it is so many mix of influences. And then, like I say, you go to Alabama is one thing, you go to Florida is another thing. And then besides that influence is the migration that adds for the huge difference. Because it is so much, it's like a melting pot.
Yeah, melting pot, exactly. Yeah, and that's what makes it tough when, if you said everybody's the same, like in Scandinavia, it wouldn't be a problem.
And going back to what was said before a little bit, going to the European countries, especially East European countries, one of the reasons why it's so scattered like that is something that happened at the end of World War I, where Woodrow Wilson came over and he's like, I think we should, instead of, you know, these are now part of your countries as it is, you guys should divide it by ethnic groups and make sure that that works out well. That didn't really work out well because it's very, at least at that stage, impossible to draw lines between ethnic groups because it's so interconnected at that time.
Yeah, like the same point about, I was saying Ethiopia, to draw a political boundary and cultural boundaries are two very different things. And when you overlap one on the other, it doesn't, you go, now you're all under this government, so you're still of this tribe, and you know, back to that point about identity, you know, people will identify themselves with their ethnic heritage before they will with some government, right? So yeah, good point about Wilson. All right, so think of it like this. So the complexity, the difficulty of creating a harmonious and political system, I should say, creating and maintaining one that enables all citizens to live together and with equal rights and again, in such a way that they can get along and function and flourish. Well, the complexity of that task is in direct proportion to the ethnic, cultural, religious, philosophical diversity. And the more diverse you get, the more complex and the more difficult it gets to maintain a government that works, a government that will enable that kind of harmony. Here's an example. Okay, I want to talk about the difference between these two terms, diversity and tolerance. But think about this. Okay, not only we can talk about religious diversity. Okay, obviously Utah is distinct for the predominance of one religious group. Okay, in the South, okay, Southern Baptist Protestants are really prominent there. In the Northeast, Roman Catholics. The West Coast is generally known, particularly Washington and Oregon, to be some of the least, in terms of established religion, some of the least religious areas in the country. Now, in Dearborn, Michigan, that has come to be known as a very heavy concentration of Muslim citizens. Also in Minneapolis, there is a concentration of Somali immigrants, and many of them are Muslim, right? So that's a pretty crazy range of diversity there. So, okay, you have Muslims. They're concentrated in particular places, and they're not, certainly far from a real strong, numerically speaking, a real strong presence. But if you lived in Michigan, you lived in the Detroit area, you'd know it, okay? Well, you also have Catholics, okay? Now, I need to change the graphic because this next one might be misleading. Okay, I don't mean this guy's religion is beer. And that's not what I was getting at, okay? But let's say somebody who doesn't have, they're agnostic, okay? They don't have any well-defined religious beliefs, but they work for Budweiser. Maybe they're the delivery driver for the Budweiser truck and they deliver the drinks to the stores. Well, in Islam, now they're different, like any religious group, there are different branches, so there could be variations on this, but generally speaking, much like as it is the case in Mormonism, in Islam, alcohol is prohibited, period. It's not supposed to be imbibed at all, and it's seen to be inherently sinful. So, what do? All right, because it's not for more traditional Christians. Alcohol is not per se, prohibited in and of itself. It's not a categorical, prohibition. So this would not be, offensive to say traditional Catholics and Protestants, and certainly, the person's job who works for Budweiser. It's important to him that people have the freedom to do that. But if you lived in Dearborn, Michigan, and there's everybody in your apartment complex on your street are all Muslim, and this is a religious belief that you hold dear, that is corrupting and it's a contaminant, maybe a spiritual contaminant to imbibe alcohol, and you have to walk down your street with your family and your kids and see a big Budweiser billboard. I mean, wouldn't that be offensive? Wouldn't that really be insensitive to some dearly held beliefs there? So what do? Should the government say, that's right, we need to protect the rights of our Muslim citizens, we need to make alcohol illegal. We need Budweiser to go out of business because that's really disrespectful to the Muslims. Okay, let's say you have same-sex marriage, a same-sex couple who are atheists. Now in that case, the Muslim is going to be opposed, fundamentally opposed, because by virtue of his religious beliefs, to what Catholics believe, to the sale and the legal sale of alcohol, and to same-sex marriage. Okay, so what do? Okay, let's say that Muslims and these particular atheists should or would be opposed. They would be opposed by the Catholic, okay, or any traditional Christian. Right? So what do? And then Muslims and Christians would, at least conservative ones, would oppose the legalization of same-sex marriage. So, given that's offensive to Jews, Muslims, and Christians, should they outlaw same-sex marriage? Should they outlaw alcohol because of the offense to let's say, Muslims and Mormons? Or what? Should they outlaw Christianity because it's offensive to Muslims, or Islam because it's offensive to Christians, right? That's hard. I don't have a clear, plan for you, but all I'm saying is, if you go to Saudi Arabia, all you have is that. That's easy to manage, right? If you go to maybe Italy, I don't know, all you have is Catholics, not all, but largely, right? Well, that's easy to manage, but when you have all that together, it's a really perplexing thing. All right, I want to end on this one point, again, about this issue of diversity and tolerance, and then we'll come back. I've got another graphic I'll show you on Thursday. So it's interesting, like I said, when you get elderly like I am, you start to notice how shifts in focus and things people give their attention to, like buzzwords, how those change over time. So, for example, when I was an undergraduate in the 90s, not that the word was not used or you never heard it, but this focus on diversity. Like you have corporations that hire diversity coordinators. I mean, maybe there's one at UVU, I don't know. But this utter priority and emphasis on diversity, that just wasn't a thing. Just didn't hear that in the way that we hear it today. But one word that you heard a lot back then, which you really don't hear much of today, is tolerance. The importance of toleration, being tolerant of other people. Now, I want to make an argument to you, and I'll come back to this. We got a few minutes here, but I'll come back to this and talk more about it on Thursday. Like I said, super complex, super challenging, difficult to think what is, to come up with some sort of government structure that really will enable a nation of our level of diversity to live in a harmonious way. Man, it's hard to do. But I will say this. The one thing is absolutely necessary, the one thing without which, I hate to sound extremist like that, but there's no way our culture or our society could sustain if we don't have tolerance. And I mean tolerance instead of diversity. And here's what I mean. Now, diversity's got to be clarified because that's an ambiguous word. It's used to mean different things, okay? I don't mean, not including people from widely different groups. Of course, we don't mean that. But what is tolerance, just in its most basic definition, what does that mean, to tolerate somebody?
Acceptance.
Means, well, I don't even know if it means that. Colton?
I would argue that acceptance is you agree mostly with the thing. Tolerance means you allow it to happen regardless of what you believe. You may disdain that thing,
Right.
which usually has a negative connotation with tolerance in some of the things that have happened in history. Even though you allowed it to happen, you were still not happy about it.
Absolutely. That's
I think
it.
it is a mix of acceptance and respect, because,
I think maybe a better way to say it is respect without acceptance.
Without,
Yeah, because like somebody summed this up well recently. I heard somebody say this on the podcast. They said there was two people talking, and the one person says, this person was just recounting the conversation, and one person says, do you consider yourself tolerant? And the other person said, absolutely. I affirm, gay people, straight people, white people, black people, Asians, Hispanics, everybody. And the other person said, okay, what's wrong with them? And he said, what do you mean? I just said I affirm gays and straights and whites and blacks and Asians and Hispanics. He says, I know. He said, you said you're tolerant of them, so what's wrong with them? And the person was perplexed. They didn't get what he was saying. But it's exactly what Colton, you just said. To be tolerant means, by definition, that means there's something about the other person's belief or behavior that you don't like, you don't agree with. But you respect the person and you tolerate it. So in other words, even though I disagreed with what you believe, the way you behave, what you're doing, I'm not going to undermine you. I'm not going to try to muscle in and keep you from having the same rights that I do. I don't like it. I don't appreciate it, but I'll tolerate it. That's not as comfortable. I mean, that's a little tension in that because we have to accept that there's disagreement.
Yeah, I said it wrong. When I say acceptance, it's like I don't accept the things you do, right? But I accept you.
Right, the person, not the belief.
Not the thing.
Right.
The person. I accept you. I respect you.
Exactly. So, anyway, I'm going to leave on that point, and then on Thursday we'll pick back up and talk about this distinction between diversity and tolerance. Hope you guys have a good rest of the day and a smooth, peaceful, harmonious election night, as I hope is true for the rest of the country.
Thank you.
All right, have a good day.
It's like, we're from St. George, but we found Capitol Reef. No one comes here. We have a park to ourselves anytime we go hiking.
this was my slide from my morning class. Oh, did I take it down?
Thank you.
All right, have a good day. Can't read it. Oh, it was. Hold on, let me see if I can pull it up.